So, all right, Daniel chapter 5 is where we're going to be in your Bibles this morning. Daniel chapter 5, we're going to get started on that chapter. And been slowly walking through the book of Daniel, and hopefully you've already got some good life lessons and some good things to recognize from this biblical book. We come to, in chapter 5, the last of the stories that are connected to the to Nebuchadnezzar and to Babylon. We're going to see a transition happening by the time we get to the end of this chapter, and move into another section of the book here shortly. But let me go ahead and just kind of, as we've been doing with each one of these chapters, we'll kind of put it into a little bit of a historical perspective for you. And also it gives you a little bit of context for understanding a little bit about Daniel and kind of imagining him as you go through the story. Again, most of our images and our pictures of a lot of these Bible characters come from our flannel graphs or flashcards or whatever. And so we kind of see, well, if you were like me growing up with flannel graph, it was the same, figure for every story. So he was like an old man when he went to Babylon. He was an old man when he was in the lion's den. He was the same picture all the way through. But we have seen just a long period of time now as the children of Israel have been in captivity in Babylon. When Daniel was about 15 is when they were first taken to Babylon back in chapter 1. And we see the statement there from the very beginning of Daniel's character coming to the forefront as he wants to make sure he doesn't defile himself. He wants to honor the Lord. And that testimony promotes him to a position ultimately of influence with the king. He's a part of the king's palace. That position of influence really came to fruition in chapter 2. Just a few years later, when Nebuchadnezzar has his dream of the statue, and he's very troubled by it, and Daniel is brought in to interpret, and Nebuchadnezzar is, we saw, impressed by Israel's God, his ability to do what the other gods couldn't do, and that was interpret this dream and reveal the dream. Chapter 3, we focused on Daniel's friends. About 17 or so years after that, where now his friends have been serving faithfully in Babylon, but it came to a point where there was something they were asked to do that they could not do. Nebuchadnezzar had built this giant statue and demanded that everyone bow down and worship it. This idea of unifying the nation under one religion. And they said, no, we cannot bow down. Our God is capable of delivering us from this, but we cannot give in to your demands. And we saw God miraculously deliver them through that fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar was once again impressed by the power now of the God of Israel. And then we kind of saw Nebuchadnezzar's story come to a peak last week in chapter 4. Daniel, now about 50 years old. Nebuchadnezzar is going to have another dream, and this one's troubling because it's got some pretty discernible imagery, a giant tree that is cut down, and Nebuchadnezzar is trying to understand what's going on, and Daniel is brought in to warn him and said, look, this is you, and because of your pride, God's going to have to humble you. And we saw Nebuchadnezzar now being not just impressed by God and amazed by God, but being humbled before God at the end of chapter 4. Well, now we come to Daniel chapter 5, and this is one that we can pretty well tie to events in history. This chapter, by the end of it, we're going to see the fall of Babylon, the transition of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, and that's pretty well established in history in 539. And so we can kind of have a time frame here. So Daniel is well up in years. That's going to play into some other things we see later in the story about some of his influence and some of the things that he is called upon to do. So we'll kind of fill in some of the context as we go through this. Well, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5, and this week we're going to just kind of get started in these first few verses. But there's a lot of background in this to make sense of before we get into the actual handwriting on the wall. So we're going to focus on that this week. So look at chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Verse 1 introduces us to a character that we haven't really seen up to this point. So we can ask kind of question, who is this? Who is this Belshazzar? It says he's the king. Well, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar? The story doesn't fill us in on a lot of those details, but let me give you a little bit of background to show you who this is and how this connects to the rest of the book of Daniel. So just kind of piecing together some of the elements from history. Nebuchadnezzar had been the king. We saw him for the first 4 chapters. He was the greatest king of Babylon. And he reigned for a long time, about 43 years that Nebuchadnezzar reigned. This story is picking up about 9 years or so after the events of chapter 4. So he already had his time of madness, and now he reigned again for about 9 more years. Eventually, though, when he dies in 562, his son, don't make too much out of his name there. It's just he wasn't. I'm not saying he was a good guy, but he wasn't called evil as an adjective. That was just part of his name. But he reigned. That was Nebuchadnezzar's son, and he reigned for about 2 years, not very long at all, before he was assassinated. Usually, once you have a powerful king, once they fall off the scene, there's all these power struggles that go on. And so his son took control, but after about 2 years, he was assassinated and replaced by one of Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-laws, a man by the name of Belshazzar. And he was able to hold power for about 4 years or so, but he died and put his son on the throne. This guy was a complete, he was a jerk and nobody liked him. And so after only about 9 months, another conspiracy pops up. He gets assassinated and gets replaced by another one of Nebuchadnezzar's sons-in-laws, a man by the name of Nabonidus. Now, Nabonidus was a very capable ruler, and so he's able to maintain some control, and he's going to be the king for the next 17 years. But Nabonidus also, he's not a big fan of palace life. He doesn't like hanging out in Babylon. Nabonidus was famous for going out and leading excursions and trying to expand the kingdom. Towards the end of his reign, he's also going to have to be dealing with an up-and-coming empire in the Medes and the Persians. So he's going to be spending most of his time out of Babylon. So for the last 14 years of Nabonidus' reign, he made his son what you call a co-regent. They were kind of reigning together. His son was king in Babylon, and Nabonidus was out, doing all of his other things. So they're both kings. And so when you see Belshazzar the king here, that's an appropriate title for him. They're kind of co-regents, but it's a father and a son. Now, what I wanted you to see with this, and again, there's not a test over this, I promise. I'm not going to quiz you over this later. But what I wanted you to see was a little sense of perspective, because it's going to play into the story a little bit later. If you just list all these kings of Babylon that go between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, you think, wow, a lot of time has passed. Not so much. From the time Nebuchadnezzar dies until Belshazzar begins to co-reign with his father is only about 10 years. There's only about, 2 years and 4 years and 9 months before Nabonidus comes to the throne. It's only about 7 years afterwards. So we're only about 10 years removed from the time period of Nebuchadnezzar by the time this story takes place. But I did want to mention it to you because, again, we're going to see have some questions later about, well, where's Daniel been during this time and what's been going on? There's going to be some things that come up later in the passage. And I just want you to get a sense it's not been a lot of time that has passed necessarily since Nebuchadnezzar was on the throne. And Nabonidus now has been reigning. So by the time the story takes place, we're about 20 years removed from Nebuchadnezzar. But I want you to kind of get a sense for Belshazzar knowing what was going on. He would have been familiar with, should have been, Daniel. He would have known Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been familiar with the events of Nebuchadnezzar's rule and reign. Later on in the story, he's going to get called on that. You should have known better. One of the judgments that God's going to pronounce on him says, you should have known. You should have understood what was going on. And we'll see why that is as we get a little farther into the story. So this is who Belshazzar is. He is the king of Babylon. He's technically the second in command. His father is king. That'll factor in a little bit later when Daniel gets promoted and he offers Daniel the third position in the kingdom. Why does he offer him the third position? Well, 1 and 2 are already spoken for. And so that'll kind of help explain some of that too. Belshazzar technically is the grandson then of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nabonidus is the son-in-law, so Belshazzar is a grandson. I mentioned that to you because you're going to see in the passage later it refers to your father, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that's because they would refer to any ancestor that way. It's kind of a generic term for, we talk about our forefathers, the father of our country. It doesn't mean like one, the very next generation. It just means an ancestor. So he is he is a grandson technically of Nebuchadnezzar. So that'll factor into some of his things. And just to mention this to you, this is just kind of extra. To see validation of the biblical narrative. This is one of those elements of the story, Belshazzar as king, that for a long time people criticized and kind of discredited the Bible on this. Because history recorded for the longest period of time that Nabonidus was the king of Babylon whenever Babylon fell. And that was the only records that we had. And so you read Daniel and it says Belshazzar was the king when it fell. And so everybody's like, oh, this story is just made up. They're inventing people and these people never existed. Well, until archaeology eventually catches up with the Bible. And all of this has been demonstrated. That yes, Nabonidus was king when Babylon fell, but his son Belshazzar was co-regent, and he was ruling in Babylon. So the Bible was correct all the time. Who knew? It's just amazing how some of those things just kind of just work out. It's almost like God knew what he was doing. All right, back to the verse. Verse 1. So now, boy, that was a long time on just the first word. Belshazzar the king made a great, you should take my classes and see how we do this. Belshazzar the king made a great feast unto 1,000 of his lords. That sounds, I don't know, a little excessive, but in these days it wasn't. Feasts like this were common in ancient times, both biblical and extra-biblical records. There are Persian kings who would host banquets for 15,000 people. Alexander is recorded to have hosted 10,000 people at a wedding. You read about Esther chapter 1. It talks about Ahasuerus throwing a 6-month-long feast. So these kings like their parties. And so Belshazzar is throwing one of these. And it says he invited 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the thousands. So the question is then, well, what are the circumstances of this feast? Why is this feast going on? Well, we know from the story that this is literally going to be on the same day that Babylon falls. I mean, by the time this day is over, the city of Babylon will have been invaded and Belshazzar will be dead. So why would he be throwing a big feast? Well, you kind of backfill in some of the history. What has been going on up to this point is that the Medes and the Persians have been advancing. The Medes and the Persians, the next empire over, has been going, and they had recently just defeated Nabonidus on the battlefield. And they had marched all the way down to Babylon. And when this story takes place, although it doesn't mention it specifically at this point in the story, the city of Babylon had been completely surrounded by the armies of the Medes and the Persians. Nabonidus has been defeated, the city has been surrounded, and you're like, this doesn't seem like a good time for a party. But I want you to kind of sense a little bit of the arrogance of this king. Remember last week we described the city of Babylon, that they had built it on the river Euphrates and made the river just run straight through it. And then they had dug canals all the way around it and then built walls. So that meant they had a water supply coming into the city. And because of the moat that went around the city was basically impregnable. It was almost impossible to attack. There would have been no way to cross the body of water to get into the city to attack it. And so what Belshazzar is saying here basically is, listen, we're safe. I know there's people out there, but there's no way they can defeat us. There's no way they can beat us. It's almost like maybe a little bit of a morale-building exercise for the people in the city, just to show them how confident he is that we're safe and we're protected and nothing bad is going to happen to us. There was also the timing of the year coincided with one of their big Babylonian festivals that they would have been having anyway. They would have had a big festival to the god of the moon. And so in a sense, Belshazzar is probably also kind of saying, well, business as usual. We're going to continue to hold the festival that we would have held anyway, because again, there's no threat. There's no problems. We're not worried about these people at all. I really want you to get a sense of his pride, of his arrogance, that there's no way anything can happen to us. This irony of this proud king who's boldly ignoring the immensity of his circumstances with a drunken feast. Whether he's just an idiot or whether he's purposeful, this doesn't seem like a very wise course of action. We'll see as the story progresses whether or not it is. Look at verse 2. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, understand that is his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. And they drank wine, and praised the gods of gold, and silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and stone. In the midst of this drunken feast, Belshazzar decides to also go ahead and add the sacrilege of blasphemy to this. He calls for the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem to be used as a part of the feast. Even if you thought your gods were superior and these other gods were nothing, this is just blatantly disrespectful. It's intentional to try to denigrate and to disrespect another god. So the question is, why though? I mean, Babylon had conquered lots of people. Babylon had conquered lots of nations. I'm sure there were many treasures in the storehouse. There were many other gods and people that had been defeated. Why does he specifically single out the God of Israel? He wants the materials from the temple specifically. Why is he singling this out? Again, I want you to get a sense of his pride and his arrogancy. Think about a couple of things that had happened, and I can't promise you that Belshazzar is familiar with every one of these, but there's no reason why he couldn't have been. No reason why he wouldn't have known these things. He would have had information like this available to him. Maybe he's singling out the God of Israel because 150 years previously, the God of Israel had written a sacred text, given a message to a man by the name of Isaiah, a prophet. Isaiah had prophesied that the people would be taken to Babylon and that they would ultimately be delivered, that the king of Babylon would be overthrown by a man by the name of Cyrus. Anyone want to guess what the name of the Persian leader is that's camped outside the city of Babylon at this point, that's been leading the Medo-Persian Empire? Now that's pretty impressive to name a person 150 years in advance, to name the person that was going to destroy the city. Remember when the Jews came to Babylon, they brought with them their scriptures. The prophecies of Isaiah would have been present with them. Daniel, very likely, had been aware of this and could have made others, and the wise men of Israel. So again, it doesn't say Belshazzar had read this prophecy. He certainly would have had access to the information. The information was available. And so in a sense, what he's doing is saying, listen, I don't care what the God of Israel says. We're safe. We're protected. And I'm going to thumb my nose at him. I'm going to tell him his prophecy is not going to come to pass. I'm going to defile his temple treasures. I'm going to show you I don't care what this God has to say. There's also the reality, and we know that Daniel was aware of this because we're going to see a later chapter where Daniel is meditating and studying this passage of Scripture in particular. The prophet Jeremiah had said that when Babylon does take the people into captivity, that it would be for 70 years. That after 70 years, they would be able to return home. Well, you're looking at the calendar on the wall. They've been in Babylon for some 65 years now. The time is getting close. And so there may have been a sense of, building excitement amongst many of the Hebrews, amongst many of the Jews. Maybe murmurs and rumors going around that, hey, this could be it. This could be the events that end up sending us home. And there's probably a little bit of excitement even in the city itself of Cyrus coming to take over and to conquer Babylon. And so again, Belshazzar is saying, no, that's not going to happen. I'm gonna again just defile the temple artifacts. I'm going to tell your God, no, he doesn't know what he's talking about. No, his prophecy is not going to come true. Remember back in Daniel chapter 2, the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had there specifically said, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, but your kingdom is going to fall. There's another kingdom that is going to conquer you and replace you, a kingdom of, represented by the chest and arms of silver. Daniel had made that prophecy known to Nebuchadnezzar, and we're only about 20 years post Nebuchadnezzar at this point. It's possible those prophecies and those events of Nebuchadnezzar's life were still available and understood even by this king. So maybe what he's trying to do ultimately is, remember we mentioned back in chapter 3 that Nebuchadnezzar got kind of bold whenever the temple was destroyed, thinking, aha, now the God of Israel is weakened because I've destroyed his temple. Well, we know that didn't work out. But Belshazzar, probably also a little superstitious here, maybe thinks, well, this is something else I can do. Maybe this God of Israel, maybe he does have a little bit of power because his temple artifacts, there's a lot of superstition here. Maybe his temple artifacts still have some sort of, residual ooga or something. And so maybe if we defile them and we sacrilege them, maybe that'll weaken this God of Israel and he won't have any power. Again, the point of all of this is that this is very targeted. He is doing an open act of defiance. This is personal against the God of Israel. There's something else we know about the Babylonian kings. One of the reasons why there was so much political turmoil amongst those kings was because the kings were, the Babylonians had they had a pantheon of gods. They had, each one of them had their own, superior god. And so a king comes to power and, well, I don't like the God that you're making us worship, so I'll do this. And I don't like that God, so I'll kill you. And a lot of the fighting and the assassinations were religiously based. So you already have this disposition of whatever your religion is, I'm going to go after it. I'm going to attack it. Well, don't forget the conclusions that we reached last week. Nebuchadnezzar seems to have demonstrated, if not genuine faith, at least tremendous affinity for the God of Israel. And some of that political turmoil may have been an effort to move the nation back to the Babylonian gods. He's celebrating a Babylonian moon festival at this point. That's the whole basis of the feast. And so to, again, squelch any remaining affinity or appreciation for the God of Israel, Belshazzar is going to say, you know what, we're just going to defile these artifacts. We're going to make sure that there's no remnant of any appreciation or any power or any influence that this God would still have over the people. The point is, he's doing everything he can to try to stop God. And I think you already know how the story is going to end. It's not going to work. His open acts of defiance, his pride, his boastful arrogance against the God of Israel. We saw how God had to humble Nebuchadnezzar for that. And this chapter is going to be all about God humbling this king for a similar situation. Incidentally, we're not going to look at it this week. Probably next week we're going to come back and visit it. But this idea of a proud, arrogant ruler who believes he can defeat God and replace God's sovereign plan in the world with his own, well, that would make a great illustration if you wanted to illustrate Satan. If only there were a passage of Scripture that connected the king of Babylon with Satan. Oh yeah, Isaiah 14. We looked at that one before when we were talking about angels. And we'll probably go back and revisit that chapter next week because it specifically describes these events. The fall of Babylon, again, predicted 150 years previous to this. Well, verse 5 says, in that same hour, while this drunken feast is going on, while they're defiling the temple artifacts, while he's thumbing his nose at the God of Israel, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. In the same hour, while this is going on, it's like this feast is just brought to a grinding halt. It's interrupted by this vision, this miraculous event. The king sees the hand that's writing things on the wall, and as it begins to write, verse 6 says, and the king's countenance was changed. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. I mean, you can just picture him, just the blood draining from his face as he just goes pale. His knees buckling. He just falls over backwards. He just goes into a complete collapse. Whatever is going on, this is definitely something that has his attention. Verse 7 says, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Kind of been a pattern in the book of Daniel, right? You know, kings see something that disturbs them, and they immediately call for the wise men, and immediately offer some great rewards, and the wise men are unable to do it. We saw it in chapter 2, we saw it in chapter 4, we're going to see it again here in chapter 5. It's this kind of repeating theme that the religions of this world, the things of this world, are incapable of recognizing and comprehending the things of God. And eventually each one of those has resulted in Daniel being summoned, and this one will as well. The wise men are promised great reward if they can interpret the handwriting that's on the wall. Chains of gold and promotion. Again, I mentioned before that he promises promotion to the third of the kingdom. That one kind of confused people for a long time because they were like, well, why third in the kingdom? If you're the king, why can't he be like vice president or whatever? Well, we know from the history now, Nabonidus was the king. Belshazzar is the second king, so he can only offer Daniel the third position. Verse 8 says, then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known unto the king the interpretation thereof. They can see it. They can see these markings on the wall, but they can't make any sense out of it. Later, when Daniel comes in, he's gonna read it. He's gonna interpret it. It's a legitimate question. It's like, well, why couldn't they read it? Were they like divinely hindered from reading it? It could be as simple as the writing on the wall was in Hebrew, and these guys don't know Hebrew. And so they need a Hebrew to come and interpret. It could be that simple. My guess is that they could see the words, but it just didn't make any sense to them. I mean, if you had never heard this story before and you just walked in and on the chalkboard behind me it said, Wade, wanting, divided. Be like, I don't know what that means. And I think that's kind of what these guys are saying. They can see it, but they don't really understand it. It doesn't make any sense to them. The words on the wall don't really make any sense. They can't understand them. So verse 9, the king Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. I mean, he had already been troubled by the vision of the hand. Now he's even more troubled that nobody knows what this means. None of his wise men. I mean, he knows it's some kind of religious experience, but the guys that are professionals at this, the guys that are supposed to know better, they can't do anything. They're all just perplexed. They're all nervous. So verse 10 introduces another character. Verse 10 says, Now the queen, by reason of the words the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor thy let thy countenance be changed. So the queen comes in. So the question is, who is this? The passage doesn't specifically tell us who it is, but you can kind of guess some things. She's not one of Belshazzar's wives because the passage already said they were already there. The wives and the concubines were already part of the party. So for her to come in, it says she's not Belshazzar's wife. It's not that queen. And so probably she's apparently very important. She can just walk in unannounced, uninvited. So she's immediately, and she kind of takes charge, kind of just starts running the show right away, giving orders, saying, you do this, summon this person, bring this person in. So this is probably what we might call the queen mother. Whether this is Belshazzar's mom, which would be Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, or whether this could even technically, because the time frame still fits, be Nebuchadnezzar's wife. This could be his grandmother. She would still be called the queen, but again, when it's Mother's Day, when mom walks in or when grandma walks in, everybody like, yes, ma'am. That's exactly what happens here. so they're all sitting up straight now, and you can kind of picture her coming in and having a stare of disapproval at the party that's been going on. And so she's going to start saying, okay, here's how we're going to fix this. Verse 11, there is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. Whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. She keeps referring to thy father. It's just another way of saying your ancestor. In this case, it's your grandfather, but your forefather here. She says he trusted this guy Daniel. Notice she keeps doing a little bit of name dropping. Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king that Babylon's ever had, the king, the one that built all of this, he trusted Daniel. And he knew something was special about Daniel. So like I said, it's been 20 plus years since Nebuchadnezzar died. And it seems like in the meantime, since that time, that Daniel's influence may have diminished. And Daniel was Nebuchadnezzar's probably most trusted advisor from the outlay of that story. But once you start bringing in new kings, they tend to bring in new advisors. Regime changes tend to bring in new cabinets. And Daniel was probably just kind of left aside and relegated because he was a Hebrew. He was an affinity of the God of Israel. Part of the religious purges was to minimize these guys' influence. So Belshazzar does not even think about calling him. So she has to remind him. There is a person who's really good at doing this sort of thing. And he helped your father, Nebuchadnezzar, out multiple times. There's also, just the realistic possibility that Daniel is some 80 years old right now. He's probably well into retirement at this point. This is an older person. So, even if he wasn't, fired from being a wise man, his influence has probably not been very great for the last maybe even couple of decades. But she remembers. And if this is either Nebuchadnezzar's wife or even Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, she would be very familiar with how important Daniel was, not just in interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, but in literally saving Nebuchadnezzar's skin. It was probably Daniel that played a big part in Nebuchadnezzar being able to maintain power and control during that 7 years while he was out of his mind. And the advice and the wisdom that Daniel brought to Nebuchadnezzar was one of the things that made Nebuchadnezzar so great. And she knows. Notice she also uses a title for Daniel. She refers to him as Daniel. She uses his Babylonian name, but only in reference. She calls him and she addresses him as Daniel. It's almost like she has a personal knowledge, maybe even a friendship with him. She uses a title for Daniel's God. She says, in him is the spirit of the holy gods. Later, when Belshazzar is going to make reference to this, he says, oh, and I heard you have connections with the gods. She doesn't just leave it generic. She says the holy God is connected. Again, I don't want to say something that's not in the passage, but she seems to have both an appreciation for Daniel and for Daniel's God that quite possibly came from Nebuchadnezzar himself and from Daniel's previous influence. Verse 12 says, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences, dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. She says he's got an excellent spirit, he's got knowledge, he's got understanding. He can solve this problem. He can fix this issue. He literally is he's good at dissolving the doubts, it said. The idea is literally loosening the knots. He can untangle this. He can figure out this for you. And so she's going to convince him to call in Daniel, and Daniel will be asked to interpret what this handwriting on the wall is. Now we're going to look at that specifically, what the message from God is next week, but I want to just at this point just kind of pause. Because there's already some takeaways I want us to recognize from this. And the main message of the passage is coming up in the second half. But some things to already notice about chapter 5 so far. Some, I think, encouragement that we can take from this chapter. First of all, remember this. God's plans are unaffected by political turmoil. This whole chapter, the background, the setting to it has been decades of intrigue and assassinations and changing leaders and this and that, and all this stuff's been going on. Babylon has been anything but stable for the last couple of decades. And notice God's not bothered by it a bit. God had already established a time frame. God had already established a timetable. No matter who the king is, ups, downs, good guy, bad guy, whatever, God says, my plans, my purposes, I've taken all that into account. Now, I've made this application several times. But as we head into a political year, regime changes, ups and downs, lots of legitimate concerns as to who gets to be in charge and who's going to be making the laws and who's going to be responsible for this. And it is appropriate for us to pay attention to that. We have responsibilities and rights as citizens. God's given us that privilege, and we ought to take advantage of doing the best we can. But at the same time, there's always a sense of there's somebody in charge. There's a God who's in control. Again, we do our part, but then we leave the results to God. And we can take comfort in that. That whatever politically seems to be going on, God is unaffected. God's plans are also unaffected by those who resist and reject Him. We're going to see a king here whose entire agenda seems to be specifically to bring down the God of Israel. I mean, he's like singling it out, targeting it. He's got an agenda. I'm on purpose going to do everything I can against God. And again, God is not diminished. God is not affected. We don't have to be superstitious like Belshazzar was. Oh, if I defile the temple treasures, then this God will be weak. No, he's not bound or limited by superstitious means. And again, no matter what is going on in Washington, no matter what's going on anywhere else in the world, there are people with agendas. There are people who are out to remove every vestige of Christianity and Christians' influences from culture and society. Oh no! No. God's in charge. So we keep doing what's right, and we just trust Him. God's power, God's plans are not affected by those who resist and reject Him. I think in this story also we can get a sense of positive and negative on this. The dangers of not passing our faith on to future generations? If I'm correct, that Nebuchadnezzar did come to a saving knowledge of God, that he did put his trust in a Messiah to come, his kids didn't seem to be affected by it. That he didn't seem to build that into that, passing his faith on to the next generation. At the same time, though, we see the queen, if this is his daughter, maybe there is an evidence of that. Either way, by the time you get to Belshazzar, there's nothing of faith. And so I think it does behoove us to just remember, we can get so caught up in our own walks that we forget that God gives us a responsibility, those of us who are parents, to pass our faith on to the next generation, to encourage them, to challenge them, to build into them, to strengthen them, to make sure that our testimony is clear to them, that they know why we do what we do and who we are, that we're passing those lessons on of faith. God had told the Hebrews that back in Deuteronomy chapter 6, that he says, I want you to love the Lord your God, and then I want you to teach your children and your children's children to love the Lord as well. This passage reminds us of the dangers of when that doesn't happen. We have faith, great. Now we share that faith with others. And then just a quick reminder here about Daniel. We haven't really seen his influence yet. He's going to show up in the next few verses, but we do recognize that Daniel's influence apparently has been diminished during this period of time. My guess is I wouldn't be surprised to find out if Daniel didn't have some suspicions during that last, the 17 years of Nabonidus' reign, maybe even the 7 years previous to that with all the political turmoil. Maybe Daniel is asking the question, Lord, what do you have for me? I mean, I used to be advisor to the king, but now, I'm basically living in retirement. I've got nothing left, no more influence. Well, he still has influence. And when the time is right, God's going to call on him. And I just remind us, none of us are done. You're still here. You have an opportunity to serve. There's no retirement from Christianity. There's no, oh, well, I used to be able to do this, or I used to have this opportunity, but I don't have that anymore, so I guess God can't use me. Remember Daniel. You just be faithful. You be available. If you're still here, God still has something for you to do. When he's done with you, you won't have to worry about it anymore. If you're here, God has something for you. So just be available and be ready. Daniel is going to do just that. A couple of announcements that I want to draw to your attention for some church announcements and then some class announcements that I want to give to you as we wrap up today. Those of you on the church email list, you probably got an email about this week, but I want to remind you also of it. Next Sunday is Pastor's 60th birthday. So the church is trying to prepare something very special for him. They're going to do something during the evening service. They're going to recognize him and honor him. But what they'd also like to do is to be able to present cards from the church. So this week and next Sunday morning, if you want to write a birthday card to Pastor Redlin and leave it at either of the lobby desks, they'll collect all those, put them into a big basket, and present those to him next week. So just be aware of that. You can do that Sunday night, tonight, Wednesday, or next Sunday morning. Now, it is a surprise, so if you see Pastor, don't wish him happy birthday today. But that will be next week, and so we'll do that. The next one is a class announcement. Now, we've been collecting for this for a while, and I wanted to give you a little bit more details and information as to what we're doing. We've been collecting funds, and I've been kind of tangentially announcing to you what we'd like to do in July is do a Christmas in July for first responders in the area. Going down to like ECSO, the Sheriff's Office, the Pensacola Police, some fire departments, and present them with some gift baskets, some snacks. They frequently need things like snack bars and meal things and things as they come in and out. And we want to be able to show them from our appreciation as a community and as a church how much we love our first responders. So we've been collecting cash in the back, and so we're going to use that to buy some supplies. But I also want to give you the opportunity to, over the next few weeks, we have class next week, and then we take our 6-week Sunday school break. Church will still meet, but there won't be adult Bible studies for the next 6 weeks after that. So still next week, but after that is a 6-week off. So this week and next week, I'm going to promote this for you so that over that 6-week time period, as you see, maybe, sales. Publix is having BOGO on, granola bars or whatever. maybe you want to pick up a couple of those and bring those with you. Now, if you want to start bringing them in next week, we'll have a box next week where we'll start collecting things. But specifically, when we come back again in July, we want to be able to have a bunch of supplies. When we start meeting again in July, we're going to take some time during those Sunday school classes to write some notes, to put with those, some notes of appreciation, some, hey, we're praying for you, some verses to share. We're going to do some things in class to put with that. And then by the third week in July, after we've met for a couple of weeks, we'll have all the supplies together and we'll get them distributed in town. So again, we're 2 months out from that, but I wanted to give you a heads up now so that we could begin collecting things. Like I said, we do. If you've been contributing money, we appreciate it. We're going to use all of that to buy supplies. But again, if you want to continue, you want to buy some things over the next few weeks, you can bring it next Sunday, or you can bring it when you come back in July. What I have on the table out there for you is some little half sheets. You can take those with you. Linda's got them. She can give them to you on the way out. That have just ideas, supplies, just some things that you can kind of keep your eyes open for over the weeks to come. A lot of these we've kind of asked some people who are in these areas, what are some things that you would like? What are some things that would be helpful? What are some things you can use? So we've kind of made the list around that. A lot of it is just individual serving things like little microwave macaroni bowls, or granola bars, or fruit cups, and anything that can be easily eaten on the go. Some things that you can heat up, like the little rice-a-roni meals, the ramen cups, some things that they could have a hot meal if they're on a shift or whatever. So you're welcome to extend your creativity beyond that. Anything that you can think of that would fall in those categories. So use these as kind of idea sheets. But if you want to bring stuff in, like I said, we'll have a table next week, and then when we come back in July, and I'll send out reminders via email and Realm about that as the days get closer to it. If you have any specific questions, stop by and see me. But other than that, I'll see you back here next Sunday, and we'll finish Daniel chapter 5.